So my name is Vanessa Grellet. I work at ConsenSys, and I lead the Blockchain for Social Impact activity, but also our Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, which is about 50 of the largest NGOs, impact investors, and technologists who want to work together based on Ethereum to create solutions for the bottom of the pyramid or to solve other problems. So I'm very excited to be here and share some of the projects we work on and how we collaborate as a group to move things forward.
Great. Alex?
I'm Alex Gladstein, the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. We're an organization that promotes civil liberties and individual rights around the world, especially where they're most at risk. So a lot of our programs have to do with reaching people who live in closed and closing societies that don't have an independent media or an independent judiciary, where the state and the control of the state is centralized, where there's a lack of democracy. So by our count today's world, about 4 billion people in about 93 different countries live under an authoritarian regime that does not allow free speech, where you couldn't really have a public debate about human rights. These countries range from Cuba to Burma to China to North Korea to Saudi Arabia. And our job is to study these countries and figure out how we can better assist civil society organizations and individuals, like journalists, for example, in these countries, to help them make their country more free and open. Our big conference is called the Oslo Freedom Forum, and it was here that we started to introduce technologists to human rights activists. And we started with helping them get a look at and get a feel for and understand digital security and the ability to send messages and communications through cryptography and things like Signal and Wicker. And this started 5-6 years ago. We began running a tech lab. And more recently, we've been working with companies like ConsenSys and others to introduce activists to the idea of distributed, decentralized, censorship-resistant systems that can help them in their work. So this is what HRF is very interested in. We're also interested in inspiring, hopefully, and encouraging people in this audience to think about how they can get involved in the human rights struggle by basically helping build decentralized architecture that can prevent totalitarian technology, which I'll get into later.
Great. Denis?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very excited to be here. I work for the World Bank. I'm basically running the IT shop in the bank for internal operation. But at the same time, we are very interested to see how we can use the blockchain technologies for development purposes. So we created 9 months ago a blockchain lab, and we started several proof of concept in many areas. And personally, I got very attracted to this technology right at the beginning when I came across. And a quick story about it is when I was in 2004, I was working for the bank. I was based in Bangkok, and there was a tsunami that took place at that time. And I don't know if you remember, but 250,000 people died during that catastrophic event. So not only the poor people, not only they lost their family and their friends, the survivors, but they also lost all their papers, their digital, all their titles. And so there was a lot of land grabbing by very powerful interests, supported sometimes by the government, unfortunately. And we managed to get together about $2-3 million from a trust fund from Japan to help the poor people to fight their rights in court. But now I can relate to this today. We didn't have the technology at that time, but this could be a good use of technology, the blockchain technology, to protect people's rights, like land titling. Actually, we have a proof of concept on this, and there are some experiments around the world. But I'm very attracted by this technology because it could empower individuals.
Great. And do you want to talk a bit about the lab that you've opened at the World Bank?
Well, I would describe it first. It started as a garage operation. This is how I describe it. So very few people started. But as I said, I have a shop that is providing internal services. But the interest was so great that I have some of my staff that volunteer their time. And now it's growing. And we're partnering with outside partners and internally with operation. And we have many let's say, experiment. We are exploring. What we want to do is to build muscle. So we're looking at land titling. We're looking at cross-border payments. Many proof of concept. We have 30 in the pipeline and 10 that we're working very actively with. And so we want to also at the same time identify what are the obstacles for scaling up.
Great. Great. So on the subject of land titling, Vanessa, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the work that ConsenSys is doing with property rights and how that could affect economic development?
Sure. So we've been working with the governments of Dubai on their land title registries, just to develop, the concept and the implementation of it. But this applies to all developed countries and developing countries. So if you look at the SDG number 1, which is alleviating poverty, one of the solutions that they're talking about to solve this is giving guarantees of titles on land. Today, 70% of the people who own land don't have a real title to it. So it means that either the government can come in and just take their land away. You have farmers that are abused by more larger landowners. And so giving title and giving property titles is really key to empowering people and giving them access to wealth distribution. So we're looking at some projects in smaller communities in developed countries whereby we have blockchain solutions that, within a certain community, everyone can recognize the title of the land. You can put attestations of reputation around the land. And it's really important also when you create a registry for land titles, you enrich the information that you have around the land. So for example, whether it's soil or just a house, you're going to have encrypted and time-stamped every event that happened to the land, right? So let's say there's a flooding, there's illegal repairs, things like that. All this is going to sort of increase the economic volume about transaction around land titles because it gives more certainty on exactly what you're buying and what the object of the property is. So let's say you have massive not oil spills but other issues around environment that are related to land. You can also register those issues so that people know that what they're buying. I have another example of a colleague of mine who has his family in India, and when they were away, their land got sold 2 different times to 2 different people. So I'm not saying that blockchain is going to be the perfect solution, but at least it will give you an incorruptible title to it, and you won't have people who can claim it without being on the blockchain.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, so I think one of the big themes of this talk and of social impact in general is economic development. And I think we've seen through an example of property rights how blockchain could help. The other one, which might be slightly more relevant to people here, is data privacy. So many of you, I'm sure, have been following the recent news about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. But to give a sense maybe of the problems with that and how blockchain could potentially be a solution, we can kind of look at China as a potential use case. And I think the Human Rights Foundation is particularly concerned and looking at this issue very carefully.
Yeah, so dictators have always dreamed of the panopticon, this philosophical idea that you can be watching everyone and know everything about what they're doing. And actually, some dictatorships in history built physical panopticons. The Cuban dictatorship, decades and decades ago, built one on an island off the coast of Cuba, and it literally has one watchtower where the warden, which you can't see from your cell, could see everybody. And this has sort of been developed by the Chinese government in a real way, and they've actually created what is very close to the perfect panopticon in terms of the way that they surveil all of their citizens through social media platforms like WeChat. So today in China, everything that you do, when you look down at your phone here, in your, all the different apps you have, ranging from Uber to Lyft to, Yelp, Twitter, Facebook, everything. All of that is in one app called WeChat, and it does everything for you, and it does things that we don't even have here. So you can, for example, say I want a loan from a friend, and WeChat will actually automatically match you with somebody, and you'll get a loan, and it's back from the Bank of China. So it does things that we don't even have here. So the problem is the government surveils all this data, and they look for red flags, they look for troublemakers. They are looking to harmonize society in China so as to prevent any dissent or anyone challenging the Communist Party. So basically, they're using technology to cement their rule. And there's a massive plan in China to, by 2020, establish a national social credit system. So, we have credit in the United States. Your credit score dictates, how large of a credit line you can draw, things like that, what kind of deal you can get on your mortgage, et cetera. In China, it's not just your credit history, it's also your behavior and your loyalty to the regime that counts into this score. And there's lots of different credit scores spread across China today. They're all different experiments. But a lot of them, you're basically graded on a number. And if you ever do anything to oppose the government, your number goes down. So it's creating these massive social disincentives whereby today in China, there's about 7 million people who were prevented from flying on airplanes, and 3 million who were prevented from going on trains. This is a report from a few weeks ago, because they had sort of bad credit scores. And right now, the bad credit scores are targeting kind of two different kinds of people. One is legitimate debtors and people who are criminals, who are thieves. But the other is dissenters, people who are protesters, people who are speaking their mind, who don't agree with the idea that there can't be democracy in China. So I think this is a very effective tool when it comes to centralized totalitarian technology. And what obviously we've seen in the blockchain space is the ability to create decentralized, distributed, encrypted, peer-to-peer architectures, which are going to be a lot more difficult for governments to control. So just the general idea from a human rights activist, from a perspective that we can send money to anyone around the world without any government stopping it through Bitcoin today is remarkable. I mean, that idea alone is really cool. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other stuff being built on top of Bitcoin and other systems like it, whether it's companies like ConsenSys or Blockstack that are encouraging decentralized storage, decentralized communications. This area is very ripe for, I think, exciting technology that can actually help human rights activists. But of course, it's as you just heard, 95% of these ideas are fraudulent or fake. So, I mean, there's a lot of noise right now, but the signal is really strong.
Great, thanks. And so that kind of brings us to a debate that's active in the community. We heard about it a little bit this morning, but there is sort of, at some point, maybe a tension between this idea of public chains and permission chains. Potentially, neither one is necessarily good or bad, or better or worse. But maybe if we can talk a little bit about how you see the use cases of permission chains and how they differ from public chains in your line of work.
Well, I think at this point in time, both are absolutely legitimate. If you have a group of institution or people, organization that decides to use a permission blockchain for a specific objective, for example, a value chain, and this is creating a lot of efficiency. So that's good. That's good for the economy. It's generating a lot of benefit. At the same time, I think there's absolutely room for a public space where we're talking about currently we have the internet of information. I think I have an internet of value supported by a public blockchain is also legitimate. So I think there's room absolutely for both of them. You need to use the right one for the right use case.
Yeah, I would echo that, and also echo some of Amber Bardet's comments this morning, whereby when you build a private permission blockchain, you have the choice to determine the governance, and it's very different if you have a very small set of actors and a very large set of actors, and so you have the flexibility to determine the governance. What's important for social impact is we face the choice of how quickly can we move to serve the underserved populations, right? So people are dying. People are dying of hunger. People are dying, under authoritarian regimes, etc. So sometimes, incremental changes that are made through private change can be very effective while we're waiting for larger solutions on the public chains. When you tackle issues like identity or land rights, etc., they're very transformational, and they also need to be worked out with some of the regimes and some of the governments. So it's a trade-off in terms of how fast you can move into bringing these solutions to help the end user. So I think we should go for both, but I think the end game is public chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the word authority, it's interesting. So you have, of course, politically, in political science, you have democratic and you have authoritarian systems. In the blockchain space, you have public and you have private blockchains. Obviously, private blockchains have a more or less, most of them have a central point of authority. Some of them, even the ConsenSys algorithm is called proof of authority, which is interesting. It basically means that the nodes can vote in a certain way, but there's a super node that can override them. So obviously, like, dictatorships are really interested in this because they want to create more elegant, efficient solutions to control the population. So they're going to use centralized private blockchains to do things that they otherwise couldn't do. So for example, let's say you're running a dictatorship and you want to more efficiently ticket people who are breaking the law with regard to traffic and running red lights and things like that. I mean, obviously you could think about how it would be convenient for them to have a all-encompassing smart ledger system installed across all of their roads in that country, and that allows them to have tighter grip on that sort of thing. So I think you need to think carefully about, like, who's building this stuff. And obviously, of course, like for businesses, internally speaking, of course they're going to build private blockchains, and that's going to be helpful for them internally. I'm more concerned about governments building blockchains and making sure that those governments are doing it in a way that's responsible. I mean, of course, right now, you look at Estonia, which has a comprehensive digital ID system, which of course has, they're starting to really phase in some blockchain solutions to that. Sure, I trust the Estonian government now, but what happens, with a Russian incursion or Russian interference? Same thing in India. I mean, more or less, I could trust the democratic Indian government now, but what if an extremist party comes to power? I mean, even in our own country, with our own issues, especially on the side of corporations. I mean, yes, I think in general, like, the government and companies here are relatively benevolent, but I don't think we can trust that they'll be benevolent forever. So I think we really have to pay attention, as was earlier said in the previous panel, about the structure of the protocols and the structure of the ConsenSys algorithms and how they're built. And this governance is something that's going to be very important. Great.
So we've heard kind of about property rights. We've heard about data privacy, some solutions there. Maybe we could talk about another kind of exciting development that I know a couple of your organizations are working on, which is the energy markets. So Vanessa, do you want to jump in or Denis, if you want to talk about what you're doing there?
Yes. Well, there's actually we just issued a paper at the bank on the use of blockchains for the trading of the carbon market. So we realize that around the world is like, as a follow-up of the Paris agreement, countries have some obligation and some targets to do, and they're developing all separate, basically, schemes. So there's an attempt to look at potentially use the blockchain technology. That would have to be managed to bring all this system together, so to make it more transparent. So we just issued a paper, I think, last week on this. So there's more detail to it, and also accompanied with identifying some of the potential obstacle to implementation. But I think it's important for any innovation to look at obstacles to make sure that we will address them. We always have to remember that I like this quote from Jurassic Park. Actually, it's just a movie, pop culture, but I like this quote from Ian Malcolm, which is the mathematician in the movie, saying that I think your scientists were too busy trying to figure out if they could, and they didn't take the time if they should. So like any other technology, we see it, for example, now with Facebook example. So I think they forgot to think about the ethical part and data privacy. So yes, on the carbon market, we just issued a paper on this. Just have to go to the World Bank website. I'm sure it will be easy to find.
Yeah. On the energy and climate, I think that's one of the most exciting areas that can have immediate impact in terms of managing carbon footprint. Through the crypto economics and the mechanisms to incite people to do carbon savings, we have a lot of solutions that are coming up in managing landfills, land rights, waste, plastic, and there's a lot of potential really impactful projects in that space. There's also a lot of coalitions that are being built. So the UNFCCC just created a climate coalition. So this is like a really a world problem that we're going to try to find avenues for people to collaborate more on this so that we can all work towards a better future. I think the enterprise side is going to be very impactful, and they'll be able to participate in these carbon credit markets and really reduce carbon footprint.
And so, when we're talking about these solutions that we've all you've mentioned on this panel, how far away are we from these really being at scale? And you mentioned the obstacles, Denis. What are the obstacles to this being adopted? Or, are they technological? Are they societal? Are they political? How do you see those obstacles? Alex, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example. I mean, I think that for us, you got to look at Bitcoin. I mean, it works. It works well. It serves its intended purpose, and it's kind of amazing that people can transact value in a censorship-resistant way without governments getting in the way. It's interesting. If you look at the fact that 10% of all local Bitcoin.org transactions, which is a network where people, basically transact cryptocurrency into fiat, 10% of them are in Venezuela, which is a country which has had such bad economic and political mismanagement that the currency is completely destroyed. People's savings are completely destroyed. There's hyperinflation to such a great extent that people are pushing around wheelbarrows of cash like pre-war Germany. And when you buy a beer at the bar, the next time you go up to buy another beer, the currency may have changed significantly. So you have such bad economic mismanagement, and the idea that you can actually control your own value and currency is I think, something that's very interesting. And when it comes to, where we are on this, I think it's super early. I think it's extremely early, but I think it's important for the human rights community to be involved in this conversation now. I mean, I really would like human rights activists, journalists, dissidents. They should be involved in creating this new architecture, so that it's not just governments and corporations doing it. I think it's quite important that we kind of cement these ideals of privacy and individual rights and censorship resistance early in the protocols of these systems.
The major barriers we see are problems on the ground, the lack of infrastructure, lack of internet access, lack of access to smartphones and connectivity. There's also lack of talent, so we need more developers to be so that it's not just the developed world creating solutions for the developing world, and there's no talent in the developing world for them to create their own solutions. I think what's really important is to work very closely with the end user and understand, what their needs are, and not creating solutions that we think are the right solutions. So, for example, if we work with refugee issues, it's always important to have, people who have had or either refugees, like we work with tech-fugees, so they always involved in their solutions, a refugee that can give direct feedback on what the issues on the ground are. So those are the major hurdles. It's actually the implementation of the technology on the ground.
Do you see it?
Yes, I'd like to follow up. There's an infrastructure problem, which is not only affecting blockchain. There's 2 billion people without smartphones. There's 6 billion people without access to broadband. There's an infrastructure problem in terms of, especially in the developing countries, of course, to use emerging technology. Skills, I totally agree. There's also legality, awareness. I mean, we're working with developing countries, and some of them, for example, they are not even willing to use cloud yet, the cloud. It will take time to change the mindset and the culture of all different actors. Lack of skills, definitely. I think this is difficult to recruit on blockchain expert. The fact that also that the data is unchangeable, it's a big plus. I mean, it's a selling point of the technology. At the same time, it makes people nervous in the sense that when mistakes enter into the system, how do you correct them, especially in a public blockchain? So you can have a solution, a technology solution to solve, for example, the land titles, but garbage in, garbage out at the same time. But I see this, for me, when I see a new emerging technology like this, which is really promising, is an entry point sometime to reform the entire sector. So you use the technology as one part of the solution, and after that you have to work on policy, procedures, and after that implementation. What's the point to have, for example, your title well preserved, digitized, but you don't have effective courts to have them enforced. So development is a very challenging issue with 1,000 of variables. So more work to do on awareness and humility at the same time. We need to remind ourselves of being humble, looking at the potential or not of technology. I remember a reaction of the CEO of Microsoft in 2007 when he was asked to comment about the iPhone. And he started laughing, saying that I cannot believe people will pay $500 for something without a keyboard. So we need to remain, very, very humble in terms of potential, but it should not prevent us to explore and use it to the best of our abilities.
Great.
I just wanted to build on that. So I just got back from Johannesburg, where we did a big Oslo Freedom Forum there, and we had lots of civil society organizations, journalists, activists from across the continent, quite a few people from Kenya, Zimbabwe. Obviously, it took about 5 years for M-Pesa to just become dominant in Kenya, which is essentially, sending money and value on SMS. Zimbabwe has its own version, which was created by a Zimbabwean, which is quite popular, and that took off in less than 3 years. So you're seeing like alternative ways to transact value popping up super fast in places where people don't have bank accounts traditionally, and where people, don't have these luxuries that we have. So I'm trying to flip this on its head. Here at UPenn, in Philadelphia, New York City, DC, London, I mean, people have depositor insurance. People have, if someone steals their credit card, they can call their credit card and censor that transaction. These are luxuries that most humans don't have. And I actually think that a lot of impact is going to happen very quickly in places where there is not rule of law, where we don't have democratic structures, and where people are ruled by basically corrupt governments that steal stuff whenever they want. And I think that these technologies can actually provide a really effective check against that if developed properly.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity to leapfrog existing solutions, failing institutions. So BitPesa, for example, is one company that does a little bit the same thing as M-Pesa. And we have to think about, when you think about the unbanked, they've been excluded from the existing systems. The existing systems are not going to change that quickly. So the question is, why don't we create new institutions for the unbanked and new ways of addressing credit and credit worthiness that is actually adapted for people who have been excluded, instead of trying to push them in a system that really doesn't work for them or that excluded them.
Great, thank you. So we're going to actually open up to questions. We've seen several inspiring examples and heard also about some of the obstacles that blockchain faces as far as helping development, as far as helping civil liberties. So at this point, we've got about 10, 15 minutes for questions. And if you just don't mind stating your name, organization, and then just keep it to one question. Great.
Could you explain what the blockchain social impact coalition is doing?
Sure. So our coalition is bringing together the largest NGOs, impact investors, technologists, and charities. And we're creating right now a foundation so that they can all work together and accelerate solutions. Also bringing down the cost of acquisitions for these types of institutions because even very large foundations are not going to have very large IT teams to deploy these types of projects. So we want to accelerate that movement and have everyone work together to find common solutions that they can deploy and also fund these solutions. So we have a big hackathon coming up this month. Usually it's about 600 people from all over the world. We have amazing companies that come out of this, and so we want to create the opportunities for people to take time to create these companies and these solutions so that they can be deployed and scaled.
They're in the red.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a researcher at UPenn. I grew up mostly in Uganda, which, although it's been fairly stable for the last 3 decades, borders South Sudan and borders Congo, which have both been incredibly unstable. So one of the reasons I'm interested in blockchain is, as you mentioned, it's a way of doing business, of having guarantees about legal things whenever there isn't a rule of law. So I'd like to ask what opportunities, but also risks would you see in applying blockchain to environments where there is to failed states or to environments where there is no rule of law?
I mean, I just to also add to that, I would certainly see risk there, and I'll let the other panelists comment on failed states, but I would see a lot of risks with Museveni implementing his own private blockchains in Uganda. I mean, this is a guy who's been ruling this country basically like his own private property for decades, and he imprisons whoever he wants that he disagrees with. He loots the treasury, and I think that there's a way to put power back in the hands of people with blockchain technology, to be frank, hopefully. And I think this is going to be something that we're just going to have to pay attention to and be involved in when it comes to very, very dictatorial regimes, at least.
Yeah. Blockchain is really a global movement, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, or other protocols. There's thousands and thousands of nodes everywhere distributed across the world. So, there's a huge room for private initiatives to leapfrog any corrupt government or any inefficient government institutions. And it's going to be very hard for the governments on the ground to stop these initiatives. I think China banned Bitcoin 8 times already. Bitcoin is still, trading. And so I think by creating these totally distributed and global systems, even if they apply only to one use case in one country, it's going to be very hard for the governments to crack down on them at a major scale.
Well, just a quick comment on this one. Of course, these are very challenging environment to work with. Fragile state and conflict states leads also to a lot of migration. It's a big problem that we're seeing in these days. So this blockchain technology actually is being used a lot in the refugee camps and to help with identities. There's a very interesting startup called aid.tech, I think, which is like helping to using blockchain to transfer entertainment digitally. So this is a good example of it. Of course, in the state per se, failed state, when the infrastructure is not there, it's so difficult to use the technology when you don't even have connectivity. But I think one phenomenon that we have witnessed over the past few years is this massive migration due to conflicts, and I think blockchain can help with refugees.
One more example I want to give for this type of initiative. So right now there's supply chain experiment in the Congo for cobalt. And the issue is, yes, you can put supply chain tracking, once the the mineral is extracted. But what happens, during the life of the journey of the minerals? You have checkpoints where people need to pay corrupt, authorities in order just to be able to take their trucks and transition them to another city. You have slavery, which is, and child labor before the extraction of the minerals. So the question is, how effective are the blockchain solutions when you're in conflict zones or very difficult situations?
I would also just add, when it comes to vulnerable populations, we have to be really careful about who owns this data and what they can do with it. So for example, let's take the case of Burma. I don't know, let's say Burma decides to put citizen identification on a blockchain, on a private blockchain that they control. This will easily allow them to see where all the Muslims are and then potentially punish them or ostracize them or do something with them. So when it comes to building these systems, we have to be really careful about who's architecting them and how they're architected. So that's why I'm kind of very interested in seeing decentralized and distributed architectures that don't allow governments to do stuff like that.
Yeah, here in the booth.
So I'm Evan. My question has to do with privacy. So you guys have talked about information privacy being super helpful and helping journalists get messages out and so forth. My question is, how do you think about privacy and building systems that encourage privacy, especially in value transfer scenarios that help people get money out of failed states or get good messages out, but don't aid and abet criminals at the same time in moving money or in moving messages?
I mean, I'll just say that from what I understand, I think the percentage of transactions on cryptocurrencies that relate to what would even be illegal things here in a free country are very small, from what I can understand. I think some of this is overblown. Not all Bitcoin is used to buy drugs and prostitutes and things like that. This is just not the case, and this is provable by both in-depth reporting about what transactions, what the oracle, where things are coming from, as well as what crime networks are saying about these things. So I think I would like to say, just generally speaking, that we should be careful about this narrative that cryptocurrencies and blockchains are used for bad things.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the major source of corruption is cash.
It's cash.
And the way you buy drugs is cash. So it's not because you have another system that's going to increase the consumption or the corruption. And I don't think it would be fair to put that on the blockchain.
Yeah, I mean, governments are going to tell you, they're going to try and prevent people from using this stuff because they can control it. So they're going to say all kinds of myths and lies about how dangerous it is. This is just what's going to happen. We've seen this over and over again in history.
All right, let's go one more. Right here, next to Eric.
Hi, my name is Saning. I run a blockchain investment firm, and we've done some work in, for example, African remittance projects, and we're looking to deploy capital and resources in a specific space. And I wanted to see if you have looked into this. There's about 500 million small family farmers. I think half are women, some kids. It just appears to us that's a really good use case to use blockchain for titling, but also to develop perhaps financial products around these farmers to help them, and perhaps linking with robotics and AI for data and increasing yields. So I think this is a problem that the World Bank has written about, but I haven't seen any projects related to that. I'm curious if this is something that you've worked on or any recommendations to look at.
Well, I'd like to follow up after this panel. We can discuss a little bit the details of. You sent me an email actually, so let's touch base after the panel and discuss the detail of your proposal. Thanks.
Yeah, I've seen some projects that are related to financial inclusion, specific to the agricultural sector. And it's also linked to the energy sector and providing energy and sort of microcredit loans, so that it creates a virtual circle. Also, the fact that you're able to, have on the blockchain the repayments of the microloans, et cetera, increases your credit and is something that can be used for other purposes. So yeah, I've seen some examples of that we can discuss.
Go here in the first row.
I'll do quick. I know you're out of time. Is there a database of all the pilots you're referring to? For instance, we have a program going on in Congo, extracting gold and all that type of stuff. We have programs going on in South America, and we're just starting to underpin them now with blockchain. Sorry, my name's Mark. But to learn from the others, to understand best practices, to understand, as you were saying, the level of detail that might be available and how that was made available would be dynamically important for those of us doing projects. The second question is OECD any place linked into this situation at this point in time?
Just to repeat the question, it's about information sharing between organizations and whether the OECD is aggregating any of this information for best practices purposes.
So currently there's a Stanford initiative that crowdsource a list of existing projects, but it's not, I wouldn't say it doesn't help you sort of understand or rank the projects. The coalition is right now doing that, and we're going to be publishing some lists, but join the coalition and you'll learn everything about it.
I'll just add, like, for projects that relate to censorship resistance or anti-surveillance or security of information, we tend to gather a lot of these people at the Oslo Freedom Forum each year, which is taking place at the end of May in Norway, and we have an entire day dedicated to this. So I can of course share more information about that, and I'd love to get students from Penn involved, for sure. So anyone who wants to know more about that can contact me at alex@oslofreedomforum.com.
Maybe one more question. We'll go here.
Maybe this isn't the place to sort of like public goods that you guys are talking about, but are you aware of any regulatory bodies being blockchain to help with transparency? Like what that is did with forcing everybody to submit information, like that route, something like that.
Some semi-government-owned bodies are looking at ways to be more efficient with the blockchain and more transparent. Charities are looking at transparency of the donations. And so it's very important for the disbursement of funds for project. So yes, NGOs and semi-government bodies are looking at that.
I know the US government in procurement is currently doing some pilot on blockchain.
I would be very careful about this because you have the Saudis and the Chinese both saying, meaning the regimes, saying they're cracking down on corruption and they want to increase transparency. But of course, they're just attacking their political opponents. They're not actually cracking down on corruption. So when you look at these models that are going to be created to increase transparency, it's really important to see who's controlling that, because if it's controlled by that party of that government, I mean, it's not going to be authentic. And I think that's something really, really, really important for us to consider.
Great. We're at time, but maybe just to leave the audience with kind of an inspiration, perhaps how they can get involved, maybe we can give one last final thought. What's the impact of, why does blockchain matter for social impact?
So I think whether you're a technologist, a funder, a philosopher, anyone who's interested in the blockchain technology, try to get involved as much as possible from the technical side to really understand the technical implications of this, because we can all, give you big examples of big ideas, but, what's important is the implementation on the ground and what the technology allows you to do, and being careful, like what Alex said about, governance of the blockchains and who owns the data and who can manipulate it, etc. So I think try to get involved as much as possible in meetups, through the different coalitions, get really informed deeply about the implications of these projects, and then you can contribute your time, your money, or your talent to all this. And intentionality in what we do is really important. A lot of people in the blockchain space will tell you, oh, blockchain is so, it's impactful in itself. Yes, it is, because it will, transform a lot of industries, but having that intentionality, if you really care about something, if you really care about women and gender equality, if you really care about the environment, if you really care about transparent supply chain, get involved as soon as possible. There are tons of avenues to do that, and the more the better.
I think the most exciting area is for impact investing. Impact investing, which is of course getting more popular as more and more organizations and institutions and funds shift from doing grants on one side of the office and investing on the other to just doing impact. What's happened is you have clean tech and health tech and ed tech and agri-tech and all these wonderful ways to achieve impact, but there's no democracy or human rights tech. And I think that this is important because when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which guide impact investing, the words human rights and democracy are not mentioned even once. That's because the SDGs are a negotiation between free countries and closed countries. And of course, the dictatorships don't want human rights and democracy to be in the SDGs. So we need to really think about how can we have impact investing that supports human rights and privacy and freedoms, and that actually can be done in this space, which is why it's quite exciting. So the idea of like a dem tech, which would be philosophy where there's a moral imperative of investing in decentralized and distributed systems that can help individual rights and freedoms, to us would be really exciting.
Well, I think the potential of blockchain is there and cannot be ignored, and this is why we have jumped on creating this blockchain lab and exploring. But I like this quote from Bill Gates that we tend to overestimate the change in the next 2 years, but we underestimate the changes in the next 10. So I think the blockchain technology will have major changes. We are at the beginning, and I just invite people to get involved and make a change and make sure that the conditions for a successful implementation for poverty reduction are there.
Great. And if you're at Penn, join the Penn Blockchain Club. All right, give it up for our panelists. Thanks so much.